Hello, my name's Jane Johnston and I'm a scholar of the public interest and communication. My role today is to explore this concept with you so that my colleagues can expand upon it within the design space. Most public interest scholars agree that the public interest cannot be defined. It's too slippery, mercurial and ambiguous. But sound words come from public interest scholar Frank Serralf, who suggested more than 60 years ago that a concept as nebulous as the public interest invites not definition but absorption. So for the next 60 minutes, I'm asking you to absorb the public interest and consider how you might apply it in design contexts. There are various typologies of the public interest as theorised, and these can provide some framing. Broadly, the public interest has been categorised in the following ways: through normative theories based on understandings of the general good of society. This approach tends towards an idealistic understanding of the whole of community. Secondly, process theories, which take several forms, but the most instructive is the procedural approach, which sees the public interest as a process of compromise and accommodation, based on multiple or pluralistic publics. This one sits best with the postmodern term that sees public interest in plural within heterogeneous societies. The third is aggregative, as the sum of individual interests. So the aggregative model sees the public interest equating with an alternative to government interests. The fourth is consensualist theories, which incorporate a communitarian approach, accepting basic rules of political conduct and principles of democratic society. And finally, the abolitionist theories, which deny the public interest as an idea ghost, because it is neither empirically measurable nor achievable because it can represent no single public interest. So if we reject abolitionist theories, then you could say there are four ways of thinking about the public interest. We know it's real. To use the state of New South Wales as an example, as at 2018, there were references to the public interest in over 250 pieces of legislation and over 50 regulations. Of course, we know that society is made up of conflicting interests. John Dewey made the cogent observation, of course there are conflicting interests, otherwise there would be no social problems, which pragmatically challenges the normative framework somewhat. It is the debate that ensues from conflicting interests that makes the public interest real, not because it represents any overarching public interest, but because it is, for the large part, about the process of seeking to accommodate competing pluralistic interests within heterogeneous societies. The realness of the public interest is further confirmed by how many disciplines have embraced the public interest. I've counted 10 disciplinary fields that use the public interest in some way or another, as shown in the slide. These are not all popular or trending public interests or theories, but they have carried weight either now or at some point over time. The point I make here, by using these short quotes and summaries, is that the public interest has currency. It can be used in multidisciplinary contexts to provide guidance as a mechanism for determining ethical, transparent, socially responsible, just, equitable pathways to governance, legislative and policy decision-making, as well as practice. In concluding, while the public interest is paradoxically simple and complex, there are three markers that I suggest can be used to frame it. First, the public interest theory starts with a problem and then addresses the problem by posing public policies and other putative solutions, including market approaches and public-private partnerships. Second, there is an expectation that a conscientious attempt is made to find appropriate answers and that decision makers are able to demonstrate that due process was followed and all relevant matters were considered in the process. And finally, to return to Frank Serralf, who I spoke about at the beginning, the public interest has what he called a hair shirt function, which acts as a constant, itchy reminder to those in decision-making positions to recognise interests of the unorganised, unrepresented or underrepresented, because those individuals will otherwise get lost in the system. Thank you.
My name's Ben Matthews, and I teach in interaction design at the University of Queensland. And my interest in public interest stems from a recent set of design projects that colleagues and myself have conducted. And it stems from a pragmatic orientation to trying to make sense of complex or wicked problem spaces. And I'll talk about one of these today, just briefly. A PhD student of mine a couple of years ago was conducting a participatory design project to try to improve remote mental health services for young people. And she was working in remote South Australia, which is, needless to say, pretty remote. And interestingly, many of the mental health cases that emerge from young people in more remote areas tend towards the severe end of the spectrum. And that fact has a number of consequences for service delivery. And providing mental health care to young people in remote areas is difficult for service providers. It's difficult for caseworkers. And the caseworkers tend then to have a fairly high turnover. So they're at risk of burnout. And this creates kind of a nested set of problems when we were looking at how to design for this space. So for patients, it's a challenge for them remotely to engage the healthcare system. And they tend to do so when they at points of really acute need. And when they do engage, then it takes time and effort and to build a trusting relationship with their caseworker. Engaging the system requires them to tell the story of their trauma to their caseworker, which is itself a traumatic experience. And once they find some help or not with the system, they will often disengage until they need it again. And so you're in the situation where if and when they re-engage, the carousel of caseworkers, and that's a metaphor we'll use for the way the system operates, the carousel of caseworkers is likely to have changed, and it requires them to build a new relationship with a new caseworker and typically retell their traumatic story. So it re-entry re-traumatizes them in some respects. And you end up with a system that can really struggle to support mental health seekers and at the same time to sufficiently support mental health caseworkers. And so designing technologies that address one aspect of this problem, such as allowing patients, for instance, to record their story so that they don't have to retell it necessarily, so it's available to a new caseworker, that may reduce the re-traumatization, but it also has the consequence of making it easier for the system to keep caseworkers on a carousel, on rotation, and also harder for the patient to build trust with a caseworker who might creepily know more about them than they've told themselves. And so continuity within the caregivers is vital, but so is their need to look after their own well-being and disengage from that kind of work as well. And so trying to nail a set of recommendations for policy, technology, and service design that serve public interests in a space like this, that includes maintaining the sustainability of the service, is a wicked problem. And the more we had discovered about the context, the less confident we were, or less certain we were of proposing workable initiatives that didn't have some kind of detrimental effect. And this is within a system where everyone is actually invested in the mental health of young remote people. And so apart from giving us a renewed commitment to change, the change was necessary. It became very difficult to know how to formulate policy that was actually engaging with systems and structures at that sort of public level. And so it raises some questions for us, such as how should design projects participate and even influence public interests, and what are design interests, and what should design interests be in circumstances like that.
I'm Skye Doherty. I'm a journalism and design researcher at the University of Queensland. So media, and particularly journalism, is one discipline or practice that tends to draw some legitimacy from the idea that it exists to serve the public interest. And it does this largely through storytelling practices that aim to tell factual and balanced stories about society. We often see this role and its value to society used as an argument to support the need for a media industry. Recently, the Senate inquiry into public interest journalism and the digital platforms inquiry, these themes kind of emerged. But certainly the technological and financial pressures on established journalism makes it increasingly difficult for the press to perform this ideal function, I suppose. So in my work, I wonder whether there's a need to explore alternative forms of public interest storytelling and alternative journalistic aesthetic, perhaps. Generally, journalistic stories are researched and written in a way that privileges factual reporting and balance. The journalist adopts a position of objective storyteller and reports what people say or do. They gather evidence via interviews, documents, observations, and then shape that into a news story that has a fairly clearly defined structure. The inverted pyramid is the classic form of a news story. In the process of doing that, they make various judgments about what we might call newsworthiness, and they have to negotiate various legal and ethical issues. And this all happens within a fairly industrialized production process. In theory, we end up with a public interest story. Now, we all know that that doesn't always happen, and there's many times when these practices and the organizational structures around them act against the public interest. In fact, there's a good number of people who simply don't trust the media and are not willing to pay for journalism, no matter how many times they're told that quality journalism matters to society and to democracy. So I wonder whether there's an opportunity to explore how we might tell public interest stories in a new way. If we design story experiences in a way that privileges public interest values, rather than the journalistic practices and production processes, what might that look like? So a few of us at UQ have been experimenting with this over the past year, and we've designed a tangible journalistic story about energy futures. Our prototype, called VIM, is designed to illustrate how a story about a public issue, in this case energy, might be designed for physical interaction, and whether that interaction can encourage participation in that issue. So the design is broadly journalistic in that it produces printed news briefs, which are a very common newspaper story format. But VIM is also an example of a designed thing, a thing designed to play a role in addressing a matter of concern. So VIM is a wooden box featuring a solar panel. It prints out stories about energy based on readers' preferences, and it also prints out a question for them to answer. The key components are a thermal printer, a 3G connected microcontroller, a battery that can be charged via the sun or via a crank by using physical effort, and then there's buttons and dials for interaction. The stories and the interactions aim to encourage readers to think about the consequences of decisions we make now about energy. So people create a news feed by choosing a philosophical position about the future of energy. That is either that technology will fix it and we'll find a solution via technology, or that actually we'll need to change the way we live and change our practices. They choose a topic then, technology, policy, economy, or society, and then the machine prints a news feed that includes stories from the past, the present, and the future, along with one of two questions, either what's the worst that can happen or what's the best that can happen? And we ask them to respond to that question and give it back to us. So this design doesn't resemble anything that we would normally consider journalism, and it certainly challenges some of the journalistic conventions around truth and time in reporting. But perhaps in doing so, we think it might prompt us to think about what other forms public interest storytelling might take. Alfredo Camarotti argues that journalistic practices have resulted in a highly developed journalism aesthetic that's gained the mark of objectivity. But because this aesthetic is so ubiquitous, we don't see it as an aesthetic, and so we accept it uncritically. So I wonder whether there's an opportunity to rethink journalistic forms and how they might address the public interest.
I'm Jason Nelson. I'm a digital artist and digital writer at the Queensland College of Art at Griffith University. And most of my research, especially lately, is looking at the back end, you could say, of all these systems. So far, Ben and Skye and Jane have been talking generally about this notion of systems, about creating pathways and narratives, organizations and geometries that are influenced by and contribute to this notion of public good. Now, some of those systems are relatively transparent and viewable, like you might design a city that removes cars from an inner city area. We can experience that, we can see it, it's obvious to us in terms of just walking around. Or as Ben has talked about, developing a new possibly structure for organization, for understanding how to help people. And so people can sort of see that and experience it and follow it. And I love Skye's project in terms of building this sort of standalone box that generates these narratives from the news that people can experience. And so these are all things that are in front of us. But increasingly, I'm interested in this notion of what's behind some of these systems. You know, as technology has developed, we're using machine learning, we're using artificial intelligence, at least in a basic way. We're doing lots of data analysis to sort of automate these systems. People want to create something they could say is more efficient, possibly is better for people. This notion of smart cities is going around quite a bit. Colleagues of mine at the University of York are working with Google to develop smart cities for Montreal and Toronto. But what does that even mean, this notion of smart cities, and what is behind all of that? And I think actually it's a real problem because artificial intelligence, things like machine learning is still in its early days. It's still in this sort of infancy period. And indeed, most people don't even know really what it is. They don't know the programming. They don't know what's actually in the back end. And this can cause, I think, increasing problems as that kind of stuff develops. And so part of my interest is looking at how do we deal with this back end, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera. Now, how can we better understand it? And then how can we use it to actually design things? So I'm looking at basically four different ways that we can understand the algorithms and the kind of programming we would need to create a system that's driven by AI, for example, that does make our lives better, more interesting, more dynamic in some sort of way. So the first one is sort of riffing off what other people have already said, which is understanding them as narrative, especially what Skye was discussing, which is that how do we think about an AI as a narrative generator? And that's particularly interesting to my own research in terms of, you know, how can we understand the narrative implications? You know, you have data going in, and then we interpret that data, and then we have a result. And that is an example of a narrative. And that is often easier for people to understand than necessarily understanding the programming. The second way of thinking about this, or trying to rethink it, I guess, is this idea of translating the world. So how can AI be used, or machine learning data analysis, to translate the world around us? And when I say translate, I'm actually thinking about this idea that everything around us, the landscape, indeed what's around us in our houses or workplaces, organizations, these are all texts. You know, a picture on your wall is a text. A car in a parking lot is a text. And so how can we use AI to sort of translate all these texts and data that's around us into something that is meaningful and something that minimizes bias? An interesting example of how AI affects bias actually has to do with face coverings. A couple years ago, there was a lot of controversy about people using face coverings for religious reasons, because they were suggesting that face recognition software used for the public good, used to surveil people, shouldn't be allowed, because you wouldn't know who these people are. And yet now, fast forward to a pandemic, everyone's wearing face coverings. And yet it seems fine. You don't see a lot of people arguing against it. It seems okay that they're doing that. So where's the inherent bias in that? It's okay for a health situation, but not okay for a religious situation. And so I think that one of the things we have to think about when translating that world is that inherent bias inside of it. Last two I'll mention quickly. One is just simply having flexibility, what I'm calling the flexibility principle, which is that we need to have AI systems that can adjust with culture and adjust with changes in society. And the last one is just simply, we should have more open source systems. We do not really know how these AI systems are working for a lot of the companies that deal and control a lot of the systems that we work within, from Google to Amazon, et cetera. So I think an open source system is going to be critical to helping us understand the implications of AI and and machine learning on the public good. Thank you.
My name is Marcus Foth. I'm a professor of urban informatics in the QUT Design Lab. I'm really grateful to Ben and Skye for organizing this, this panel and for being able to join this conversation, which I think is a very timely and important topic. What I'd like to do is add into this conversation a couple of thoughts that I've been thinking about and research that we've been working on to do with scale making and to do with the role of interaction design in the public sphere and in interacting and engaging with publics. The starting point that might be quite useful is actually a paper that Steve Harrison, Deb Tatar, and Phoebe Sengers have published already quite a number of years ago at CHI 2007. It is very highly cited. It's called The 3 Paradigms of HCI. And in that paper, they propose that historically, the field of design research and specifically interaction design has developed and moved on from a paradigm of interaction between man and machine, or human and computer, to one that is much more around the interaction as an information communication medium. And finally, the third paradigm of interaction as being phenomenologically situated. What this paper though also has done is trigger a big conversation around what would be the fourth paradigm. What comes next? What is the next thing? And what we've been doing and what others have, I think, been proposing is a direction that looks at HCI and interaction design beyond usability, beyond the focus on the individual user and the context at this very individual and rich qualitative level, perhaps. This is not to say that design research is supposed to jeopardize its current focus on qualitative approaches, but it's actually questioning what our take is on impact and on scale making. And in that regard, what I found really quite interesting is a proposition by Lisbeth Hubrechts in Belgium that was published in the Core Design Journal in 2017. And Lisbeth and her team is proposing this notion of institutioning, which I think connects to a number of the cases that that Jason and Skye, Ben as well have brought up, but specifically to what Jane has outlined in the beginning around the idea of publics. So institutioning is a neologism that designers like to create, I suppose, and it falls under that rubric of infrastructuring, another neologism and verbism. So what we are trying to allude to here is the kinds of ways design research can make inroads into institutions. Now, institutions would arguably play quite a significant role when it comes to generating and maintaining, as well as amplifying the voices of publics. In a polity, they are they play a significant role in the way that opinions are formed, in the way that things get done. And when we talk about these things, they are beyond individual consumption and they're beyond individual behavior. So it does connect quite nicely to this earlier point about moving beyond usability and perhaps engaging a notion of citizenship. So what we've been trying to critically review is a bunch of projects in what Jason just alluded to in the smart city space. A lot of local governments think that design is really sexy and a hot topic, and they like using design approaches and design methods. But what we also found in that regard is critically looking at some of these projects of community engagement, of public participation, of using situated engagement tools for urban planning and allowing people to feed into decision-making, which is all to do with what the public's role is in institutions and in dealing with institutions, that some of the institutions actually co-opt design methods. And what we mean by co-optation is that they like the shiny things, but they don't want to take the entire cake. What I mean by that is that some of the kinds of methods that has created, for instance, a huge hype around design thinking, they are not necessarily taken 100% into the context of institutions, but it tends to be a situation where institutions cherry pick what is useful for them in order to convey a notion and an appearance of being participatory and engaging the public. So as a result of this recognition, what we've been trying to understand also on the basis of Lisbeth's article and the notion of institutioning is, what are we going to do about it? One of the things that we've been thinking about is the idea of scale making. How can we use design not just to perfect the kinds of methods we use inside the frame of design research and design activity, but actually the question of what happens afterwards. And this graphic that I've constructed here is looking at the relationship between the notion of institutioning, commoning, and infrastructuring as a way to actually aim higher, aim for other spheres in the system of polity that are beyond the hyperlocal and beyond the user.